19 on the blood vessels. So this will be a shorter unit, which means the time between the exam you're taking on Thursday and the second exam will be a much shorter interval. We'll be covering less material. So it'll be Heart and Blood Vessels, Chapter 18, which we're going to start today, and Chapter 19 on the blood vessels. And in lab, as your morning lab knows, we started our study of the heart anatomy today, which we'll obviously do this afternoon as well. Okay, first of all, the heart itself, as you know, is located in the thoracic cavity, in that medial portion, which is called the mediastinum, and it's surrounded on either side by the pleural cavities, which house the lungs. And it's roughly the midline, but most of the heart actually lies more to the left in the midline, about 2/3 of it. And it's positioned at an angle, obliquely. The base of the heart is the superior part of the heart to which the major blood vessels attach. And the more tapered or pointed part, which is inferior, is called the apex. And again, it's the mediastinum, that's that medial cavity in the thoracic or chest cavity. It is also surrounded by a protective membrane called the pericardium. Para means around, cardium refers to heart, so literally it's around the heart. It consists of 3 layers. The superficial layer is dense or fibrous connective tissue. So it's called the fibrous pericardium. It's a very tough layer. So again, this is the outermost or superficial layer of the heart wall. Again, it's made of dense or fibrous connective tissue. So it's a tough membrane that surrounds and helps to protect the heart. It also anchors the heart to the diaphragm, which lies just inferior to it. The diaphragm is that band of skeletal muscle that runs transversely and separates the thoracic from the abdominal pelvic cavity. It also attaches the large blood vessels that come out of the base, or attach the base of the heart. And further, it helps to prevent the heart from overstretching. So that's the fibrous pericardium, the superficial part of the pericardium. Just deep to that is a serous membrane. Now you may remember, or perhaps you don't, from A&P 1. Hopefully you talked a little bit about membranes, mucous membranes, serous membranes, and so on. Serous membranes are a double-layered membrane. They consist of 2 thin layers. The more superficial layer is called the parietal layer, and the deep layer is called the visceral layer. So we have a parietal serous pericardium and the visceral serous pericardium, which are both deep to the fibrous pericardium. The parietal pericardium is attached to the fibrous pericardium and lines it. The visceral pericardium, or excuse me, the visceral serous pericardium is attached to the surface of the heart wall. And it's actually considered the outermost layer of the heart wall. So you'll see it also referred to as the epicardium. Again, both these are very thin membranes, simple squamous epithelium. Remember, simple squamous, a single layer of flattened cells, and a little bit of loose connective tissue. Both these secrete a fluid, the parietal and visceral layer, that's called pericardial fluid, and it's in a little space or cavity between the two. And that acts as a lubricant. Because of course, as the heart is moving with contraction and relaxation, these membranes slide across one another. So you need a lubricant, just like you do in a vehicle engine. You wouldn't have moving parts without the lubricant, or pretty soon it would seize because of the friction. It builds up the heat. So again, we got the outer membrane, denser fibrous connective tissue. Deep to that is the serous pericardium, consisting of 2 layers. That outer layer, the parietal layer, is attached to and lines the fibrous pericardium. The inner layer, the visceral pericardium, is attached to the heart wall, and actually considered the outermost layer of the heart wall, so it's also known as epicardium. And again, the space between parietal and visceral layer is called the pericardial cavity. That's normally filled with pericardial fluid, which acts as the lubricant. Sometimes things go awry, you don't have enough fluid, and then you get inflammation of the pericardium. That's called pericarditis. You get inflammation, what happens? You get fluid accumulation, so you build up more fluid in that space. That puts pressure on the heart, and that's called cardiac tamponade. And that can make it more difficult for the heart to do its job, because it's putting pressure on the heart itself. This is your textbook. You can see this cutaway view of the heart wall. We can see here is the surrounding membrane, the outermost, which is a thick layer of connective tissue, denser parts connective tissue, the fibrous pericardium. Then lining that would be the final layer of the serous pericardium. You see it adheres to and lines the fibrous pericardium. Then there's a space, that's the pericardial cavity, which is filled with fluid, pericardial fluid. And then the epicardium, again, is a thin layer, and that would be the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. That adheres to the heart wall. So it's also known as the epicardium. Okay, so that's the pericardium. Fibrous pericardium on the outside, lined with the final pericardium, then the space, pericardial cavity, and then covering the surface of the heart wall itself, and consider the outermost layer of the heart wall, the epicardium, which is surrounded with the visceral pericardium. Again, in this space, the pericardial cavity, you have fluid, which acts as a lubricant. Okay, the rest of the heart wall then, epicardium again, remember, this is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. The myocardium then is the thick muscular layer that makes up the middle of the heart wall and the majority of the heart wall. And this consists of cardiac muscle, which, as you know, is confined to the heart. Cardiac muscle somewhat resembles skeletal muscle in that it is striated. These alternating light and dark bands that are visible under the light microscope when you view a stain preparation. But unlike skeletal muscle, it is involuntary, which means it's not under conscious control. You can't decide when to contract and relax your heart. That happens automatically, fortunately. You don't have to think about it. Okay? You can adjust the heart rate. You don't basically just stop it or turn it on and off. It's an ongoing process. So again, this is the myocardium. It consists of cardiac muscle, striated muscle, but involuntary muscle. And you'll also notice, when you look at sections of cardiac muscle, which you probably did in AP1, that it has something we don't see in skeletal muscle. And these are called intercalated discs. The intercalated discs also run transversely, but they're much thicker than the striations, those alternating light and dark bands, which have to do with the arrangement of thick and thin filaments. What they are, though, is a thickening in the cell membrane between adjacent cardiac muscle cells, which helps to support those cells. So it's a thickening in the cell membrane between adjacent cardiac muscle cells. And within it, more than just that, it has basically what are called desmosomes, which help to hold those adjacent cells together. This in the intercalated discs, these desmosomes. And then something else very important. Gap junctions. So the desmosomes consist of fibers that help to hold the adjacent cardiac muscle cells together. Gap junctions are tiny little pores or openings in the intercalated disc, which allow for the spread or rapid transmission of oxygen potentials between the cardiac muscle cells. Cardiac muscle cells work together as a single unit to give you more forceful pumping action, much like you see in most smooth muscle. It works as a single unit. Unlike skeletal muscle, where you have these motor units, you got a bunch of muscle fibers which basically are stimulated by usually a single somatic motor neuron, and there tends to work in small groups in skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle usually works as a single unit, at least most smooth muscle, and so does cardiac muscle, for a very obvious reason. If the cells contract independently, you wouldn't get any effective pumping action. So working as a single unit, when you stimulate one cell, you basically quickly stimulate all the cells, and they get this contraction in unison to give you a nice forceful pumping action. So these gap junctions basically allow for rapid transmission of action potentials between the cardiac muscle cells, so they can contract and relax together. As we're going to see when we get into the conduction system of the heart tomorrow in lab, the heart contains specialized cells that are self-stimulatory. The heart can beat independently even when it's several connections in the nervous system. The nervous system does not stimulate the heart to contract. What it does is adjust heart rate and force of contraction. The actual physical stimulation lies within the heart itself in specialized tissue called conduction tissue. You probably heard of the pacemaker. We're talking about natural pacemaker, which is built in basically the heart itself. Okay? But for that to work effectively, the heart has to pump in a certain rhythm. You want to basically have the atria contract and shoot the blood into the ventricles, then the ventricles contract and shoot the blood out. If they get out of sequence, and you do not get an effective pumping action, and if those cells contract independently, you're also not going to get an effective pumping action. So that's why you've got to have coordination in the contraction in these muscle cells, working as a single unit. Very important. And these gap junctions in the intercalated disc allow for this rapid transmission. Okay, these are actually electrical synapses. When you were studying the nervous system, you may have talked about the chemical synapses, electrochemical synapses, which is typically what you see between, let's say, a nerve and a muscle cell, or nerve to nerve. Remember, you got the impulse, action potential coming down the axon, stimulates the release of a neurotransmitter. That diffuses across the synaptic cleft, which is picked up by another cell, postsynaptic cell, maybe another neuron, or maybe a muscle cell. So it's electrochemical, the chemical being a neurotransmitter. And that's a one-way passage. Can't go either direction, goes one way. These electrical synapses go either way. And you're basically sending charged particles basically from one cell to another. So very rapid transmission and coordination of the contraction activity. Very important. These gap junctions in the intercalated disc, the cardiac muscle cells. Okay. Also, too, when you were studying the heart, or I should say the skeletal muscle in AMP1, you probably learned there's a lot of connective tissue sheaths around the muscle. Skeletal muscle, that is. There's a dense fibrous connective tissue membrane that surrounds the actual muscle itself, the entire muscle. That's called the epimysium. There's also connective tissue sheaths, usually dense or fibrous connective tissue, around bundles of skeletal muscle fibers called fascicles, perimysium. And then the individual cells themselves have a loose connective tissue sheath called the endomysium. So epimysium to perimysium to endomysium. So skeletal muscle is well supported by connective tissue. That is not the case in cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle, the only sheaths you really have are the endomysium around the individual muscle fibers. So to support the muscle, cardiac muscle, in the myocardium, you have a fibrous skeleton of the heart, which consists of bundles of collagen fibers. It's dense or fibrous connective tissue that runs through the myocardium and supports it. That's called the fibrous skeleton of the heart. So it's sort of like a built-in internal skeleton. It's not bone and cartilage, it's dense or fibrous connective tissue. The fibrous skeleton of the heart. Okay, so that's the myocardium, the thickest and middle layer of the heart wall. The line of the heart, then, again, is a very thin layer, simple squamous epithelium, a little bit of loose connective tissue, and that's called the endocardium. This lines the heart chambers, the atria and the ventricles, and covers the surface of the heart valves. So those of you in the morning lab know what the heart valves do. What's the function of the heart valves? Make sure the blood flow is going in one direction, and you don't get backflow into a chamber from which the blood came when the succeeding chamber relaxes. So you have valves between the atria and the ventricles, you got valves and the arteries that drain the ventricles. And as I said, we went through that this morning, and we'll do it this afternoon as well. Okay? Again, the endocardium is the lining of the heart chambers and covering the heart valves. Simple squamous, a little bit of loose connective tissue, and not surprisingly, it's continue with the endothelium. What's the endothelium? Hope that rings a bell. It should.
The endothelium is the inside.
Should know it.
Inside.
It's the line of the blood vessels. Simple squamous, loose connective tissue. So the endothelium, line of the blood vessels, continues with the endocardium of the heart. Very similar. Okay? So 3 layers. Epicardium on the surface, also called the visceral pericardium. Simple squamous, loose connective tissue, very thin. And the big thick layer in the middle, largely cardiac muscle. And then these bundles of fibrous connective tissue that run through to support it, fibrous skeleton of the heart. And then the lining again, very thin, simple squamous, loose connective tissue, endocardium. Okay. You may have heard of endocarditis. That's where you get an inflammation of the endocardium, which sometimes results from a bacterial infection. Okay, the 4 chambers by now, that should be second nature to you. You've got a pair of atria, okay? And the atria, remember, receive blood, returning to the heart. Remember, VABA. Veins carry blood to the heart. It always comes into an atrium. From an atrium, it goes to a ventricle. From ventricle, it exits via an artery. So veins, atria, to ventricles, to arteries. All right, so a pair of atria. Atrium singular, atrium plural. What are the auricles? Those are those on the lateral margins, okay, of the atria, kind of look little folds. So they're actually part of the atria, sometimes called the auricular appendage. And the ventricles then, of course, these are the muscular pumping chambers that actually push the blood out from the heart. And remember, there's a partition that divides the heart into right and left sides. Between the 2 atria is called the interatrial septum. Inter means between. And septum is just a wall or partition. So the interatrial septum divides the right from the left atrium. You've also got a partition between the ventricles. That's called the interventricular septum. Again, a wall or partition, in this case dividing the ventricles, right and left from one another. Also, on the surface of the heart, there was a shallow groove called a sulcus. And when you were studying the bones, you would learn all these terms, okay? And one should have been sulcus, which is a shallow groove, okay? In this case, it's a shallow groove on the surface of the heart. In the front, it's called the anterior ventricular sulcus, and it basically runs between the right and left ventricle. The back of the heart is called the posterior interventricular sulcus. Again, shallow groove between the right and left ventricle. There's also a groove that runs around the circumference of the heart, separating the atria from the ventricles below. That's called the atrioventricular sulcus or the coronary sulcus, because this is where your coronary sinus runs. Remember, the coronary sinus is that big vein that is draining all the cardiac veins into the right atrium. So septum is the wall or partition. The sulcus is the groove, shallow groove on the surface of the heart. And you often have blood vessels running along those grooves. This is overlap. Okay? So again, atria receive blood returning via the veins to the heart. They push it into the ventricles. The ventricles then pump it out from the heart to arteries. Veins to atria to ventricles to arteries. Then all you have to do is plug in the major vessels. Common everyday words, right? Household words. In a KV and so on. Okay, valves. The valves, again, ensure a one-way flow, just like we saw in the lymphatic vessels. They're to keep the blood flowing in one direction. In that case, it was always toward the heart. In this case, it's to keep it going in a certain direction through the heart, which is something I want you to know. I think I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Learn the normal blood flow through the heart, okay? And since you'll be learning the details of the heart, okay, I'll expect you to tell me the chambers and the valves, as well as the major blood vessels and any organs that lie between, right and left side, which would be what? The lungs. blood is returned from the body, goes into what? All blood returning from the body.
The atrium.
The right atrium, okay? Deoxygenated. There
And
it goes
to
into the,
lungs.
not yet,
Then
right ventricle, okay? Right ventricle out to the lungs, then back from the lungs to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, and out, okay?
But you want to know all the chambers,
All the chambers, the valves,
valves.
and of course, don't forget the lungs in between. And what I'll probably do is give you a vein on the left side of the body and ask you to trace it through the heart to an artery on the right side. And whatever you do, don't take the blood, regardless of what vein is coming in, and take it directly into the left side of the heart. Left side of the heart, remember, handles only oxygenated blood. So what do veins do? For the most part, they're carrying deoxygenated blood returning to the heart. So where's it going to go first? Always to the right side, right atrium, right ventricle, lungs, then back to the left atrium, left ventricle, and out. All right? The only blood vessels that carry blood into the left atrium are what? Pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins only. Okay? So if I give you a left brachiocephalic vein, don't take it in the left atrium. But whatever you do, don't connect it to the aorta. Veins and major arteries never directly connect. Okay? Or you blow the vein out, you know. The wall is so thin. So veins always have to what? Go first to an atrium, atrium to ventricle, ventricle out to the artery. Okay? So think about this. Going, well, it's left side, therefore let's go to the left side of the artery. No. It's got to return first to the right side, then to the lungs, then back to the left before it goes back out. Yes?
When on test, are you going to give us from and to?
Yeah, I'll say trace from this vein, left to right, to this artery, left to right.
So that would include.
But in between will lie the heart.
That would include the major arteries and veins and all
Mhm.
that.
Yes.
Okay.
I'll say all the major blood vessels, all the valves, chambers, and of course, put the lungs in there. All right? And guess what? Left and right, superior, inferior, and so on. Okay? So be thinking about that. What connects to what? We're going to do this through the whole course. Okay? Get the respiratory system, I'll say trace the air, from the outside of the body to the alveoli, and back. Inhaled, exhaled. All right? Get the digestive system, trace through the digestive tract, from oral cavity, the mouth, to the anus, all the way through. Okay? So get used to it. What connects to what? I'm talking about who's taken course from you before. They say, he's great on these trace questions. You better know your trace. So, get your warning right now. You will see them. Okay, the chambers then. We talk about, let's look at the valves. 4 chambers, 4 valves. Now you can see the heart valves themselves are composed of dense or fibrous connective tissue, and guess what? They're covered by the endocardium, the same stuff that lines the heart chambers. Their function is to keep the blood from flowing back into the chamber from which it came. We have a pair of valves that lie between the atria and the ventricles. So collectively, these are referred to as atrioventricular valves, but I would like you to know them by their specific name. On the right side, the atrioventricular valve is called the tricuspid valve. The cusp is the valve flap. Tricuspid because it's got 3 cusps or flaps. So again, this lies between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And its purpose is to keep blood from flowing back into the right atrium when the right ventricle contracts, which means that valve has to close before the ventricle contracts. Otherwise, it's going to shoot right back into the atrium. So the only exit from the ventricle will be the artery which drains that ventricle. On the left side, the atrioventricular valve is called the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve. You may know it as the mitral valve. Either term is acceptable. Bicuspid because it has only 2 cusps or flaps. And again, this valve lies between the left atrium or left ventricle. And again, it serves to prevent a backflow of blood into the atrium when that ventricle contracts. So those valves close before the ventricles contract. So again, the only exit for the blood is through the artery draining that particular ventricle. Now, both the tricuspid and bicuspid valve have cords of collagen fibers attached to the valve cusps at one end. At the other end, they attach to extensions of the cardiac muscle in the ventricles. These have a fancy name. They're called papillary muscles. And those of you in the morning lab, I'm sure saw these. You saw the chordae tendineae, you saw the extensions, the papillary muscles, and the valve cusps. Okay? And their function again is to keep the valve cusps together. So when the ventricles contract and slam blood up against the walls, they're going to hit those valve cusps. There's nothing holding them in place. What are they going to do? They're going to open, blood goes right back into the atrium. And you're not going to get much pumping action from that ventricle. So you've got to have intact valves. If the valves aren't working properly, they're really leaky, what happens? You're not getting effective pumping. It may be so severe that you have to have a valve replacement. Otherwise, you're not going to be pumping out much oxygenated blood. And the result is you're not oxygenating the tissues very well.
Does that also affect your breathing?
Well,
If you're
it can
not-
affect, you'll be breathing, but you may be panting a lot trying to get more air in because you're not effectively aerating the blood.
So the
So
blood
people have a
flowing
valve
with,
problem, yes,
right.
it's very severe. Now, a lot of people have a minor, leak in a valve that's called a murmur. They can live with that. But if it's really severe and you're getting a lot of backflow of blood, then it may require repair or replacement of that valve. Chordae tendineae are also called the heart strings, okay? And of course, we tend to associate, or at least originally we associate emotions with the heart, okay? But in reality, the emotions are centered in the brain, and specifically the hypothalamus. But it doesn't sound very romantic to say you love someone with all your hypothalamus. Okay? If you don't have any science background, you'll probably get slapped in the face if you're a guy, because she'll think you're making fun of her or you're talking about some other anatomical part. Okay? But anyway, all these are chordae tendineae, not the heart strings. Right? But that's technically what they are. And you should know what they do. Okay, we've also got valves in the arteries that drain the ventricles. And these are called semilunar valves. And again, there's one in the artery that drains the right atrium. And remember, it's the pulmonary trunk that drains the right atrium. So that valve is called a pulmonary semilunar valve. Semilunar because the cusps sort of resemble a partial moon. Lunar refers to moon. So semilunar. On the left side, in the artery that drains the left ventricle, remember that's the aorta. This is called the aortic semilunar valve. And in both cases, the valve flaps or cusps are kind of cup-shaped. And these are passive valves. When the ventricles contract, it shoots the blood out, and it simply parts the cusps. The blood shoots down that artery then when the ventricle relaxes, some of the blood is going to flow back from that artery and try to get back into the ventricle. But what happens is it catches in the cup-shaped cusps, pulls them together, and closes the valve. So these are the semilunar valves. On the right side, in the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary semilunar valve. On the left side, the aortic semilunar valve. Again, the cusp of the semilunar valves have these three pocket-like, or cup-shaped cusps.
Dr. Harrison,
Yes.
our book just calls them aortic valve and pulmonary valve. Do we need to make sure we know?
I want you to call them
semilunar?
pulmonary, semilunar, and aortic semilunar. Okay, then your book just calls them pulmonary and aortic. I want you to add that semilunar. Okay, but I want you to know that it's got these cup-shaped cusps. Okay. And don't say what the book says. Okay. The book's not making up the test. The book I'm making up the test. All right. So this is not a democracy. Okay. It's a dictatorship. Okay. Hopefully a benevolent one. This is from your textbook, and it shows basically the valves. Gives you an idea how they work. Okay, what we're showing here is an atrioventricular valve. here, and they're showing it here over on the left side of the heart. So you basically have the bicuspid valve here, and these are the valve cusps. They're the flaps. These are bundles of collagen fibers, which are the chordae tendineae, and these are the extensions of muscle in the interior of the ventricles, called the papillary muscles. So what happens is, of course, when the valve's open, it's in this position, and the blood just simply flows in from the atrium into the corresponding ventricle. Then when the ventricle is ready to contract, these muscles contract. What they do is they hold the valve cusps together, like you can see here. So when the ventricle contracts and shoots the blood up against the walls, also against the cusp, these things aren't going to part and allow the blood to go back into the atrium, which it came. As we're going to see, these muscles contract first. They basically are holding the valve cusp in place prior to the rest of the ventricle contracting, and shoot that blood up against the walls and the valve cusps. And that's the way both the tricuspid and bicuspid valve work. Okay? Chordae tendineae again, bundles of collagen fibers. On one end, they're attached to the valve cusp, the tricuspid valve on the right, bicuspid valve on the left, and the papillary muscles, which are extensions of muscle inside the ventricles. Okay? So they hold the valve cusp in place, keep the valve closed when the ventricle contracts. Otherwise, they're open. As we're going to see, actually, most of the blood flows through the open tricuspid and bicuspid valve before the atria even contract. And then when they do contract, they shoot the rest of the blood from the atria into the ventricles. And then before the ventricles contract, these valves close because the cusps are held in place by the chordae tendineae attached to the papillary muscles. And then the only outlet for that blood when the ventricle contracts is through the semilunar valves and the arteries that drain that corresponding ventricle. Okay? And again, take a look at this in your textbook. This just shows the semilunar valves. Okay? And again, we're talking about the left side here. You can see the left and the right. But what you can see is when the ventricles contract, of course, they shoot the blood out through the arteries. In this case, on the right side, it would be through the pulmonary trunk. On the left side, it shoots it out through the aorta. But in both cases, you have these cup-shaped or pocket-like cusps. And they're passive valves. There are no chordae tendineae here. So the blood basically just passes out, separates the cusp, and shoots out into the artery when that ventricle contracts. And when the ventricles relax, some of that blood is going to flow back. It's going to catch these cup-shaped cusps and pull them together and close the valve so the blood doesn't leak back into the ventricle from which it came. So in all cases, the valve is to keep the blood from going back into the chamber from which it came. Tricuspid and bicuspid valve keep the blood flowing back into the atria when the ventricles contract, and the semilunar valves on both right and left side keep the blood flowing back from the artery into the ventricle from which it drained. Okay? Or which it exited. Any questions on this? Again, look at the diagrams here, and again, refer to the valves. Tricuspid valve and bicuspid valve, not just atrioventricular, and then the pulmonary semilunar valve in the pulmonary trunk draining the right ventricle, and the aortic semilunar valve in the aorta draining the left ventricle. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Let's trace the normal pathway of blood then through the heart. And again, remember, as I've said a number of times, VAVA. It's always veins to atria, to ventricles, to arteries. That's the normal flow through the heart. And remember, the right side of the heart is associated with a pulmonary circuit to the lungs and back to the heart. And the left side is associated with a systemic circuit out to the rest of the body and back to the heart. So let's just plug in the veins and the vessels. And we're going to start with blood returning from most of the body, which goes into the right atrium. And the major veins that carry blood into the right atrium, which you should know by now, are the superior vena cava, draining the upper part of the body, head, neck, arms, shoulder region. Inferior vena cava, During the lower part of the body, rest of the body and the legs, and then the coronary sinus, which actually drains the heart wall itself. Okay, so blood comes in to the right atrium contracts and pushes the rest of the blood through the open tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Then the tricuspid valve closes, the right ventricle contracts, this forces the blood through the only exit, which is the open pulmonary semilunar valve, into the pulmonary trunk. That, of course, quickly splits into right and left pulmonary arteries, which carry the blood from the right ventricle out to the lungs, right and left lungs respectively. There, of course, the blood picks up oxygen and gives off carbon dioxide, then it returns to the left atrium via the right and left pulmonary veins. Again, be careful. When you're looking at those lung models, the blue vessels are what? Those are the arteries, and the red ones are the veins. And as I said, it's that pulmonary circuit is an exception. A general rule that arteries are carrying blood of higher oxygen content than corresponding veins, not in the pulmonary circuit. Where's the other exception? You saw it on the pig, hopefully. Where the vein is carrying blood of
The
higher
baby
oxygen
to
content
the
than
placenta.
the umbilical.
Umbilical.
Okay, remember you had a pair of umbilical arteries on either side of the urinary bladder, and one single umbilical vein coming back. Higher oxygen content in those arteries. Okay. All right, so it comes back to left atrium. Left atrium then pushes the rest of the blood, once it contracts, into the left ventricle, the open tricuspid valve. Then the bicuspid valve closes. Left ventricle contracts. This forces the blood through the only exit then, which would be the open semilunar valve, the aortic semilunar valve, out into the aorta, which then distributed via other arteries to the rest of the body. Okay? Simple, right?
Mm-hmm.
Plug in those in. You already know those vessels anyway. But don't forget the lungs in between, and don't forget the only vessels returning blood to the left atrium are what? Right and left pulmonary veins. Okay, so you got a vessel on the left, a vein, you're asked to trace through the heart to an artery. You've got to go first into the right side of the heart, to the lungs, then back to the left and out. Okay? Please don't forget that. I like to say when I'm ready. All right?
We'd like for you
It's a
to.
lot easier to grade when you got all the answers there. I don't have to stumble through these, you know. Okay, and that's what makes some of these lab tests tough. I got to go through them. What did you say? What did he say? You know, I got to go through it all over and look. All right, but anyway, make my life easier too. All right. Keep me happy. I like to see you all get A's if possible. All right. Doesn't usually happen, but the more the better.
Absolutely.
Any questions on this? Okay, so you should be able to trace the blood through the heart. If you have a vein anywhere in the body, you can take it through the heart into an artery. Anywhere in the body. There will be major ones, okay? Okay. Also, you should know by now that the heart wall itself is too thick to provide much benefit from the blood passing through the chambers. So for this reason, it has its own circulatory system. And this consists of arteries that branch off the ascending aorta. These are actually the first branches off the aorta, even before you get to that aortic arch. And these are the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery, which then branch into smaller and smaller arteries that supply the heart wall itself with oxygenated blood and nutrients. And then you can see they're just beyond, or just superior to the aortic semilunar valve. So these are the first vessels that actually branch off the aorta. They're coming off the ascending aorta. Okay. I want you to know there are two major branches off of each of these arteries. Okay, so in the left coronary artery, the two major branches are the anterior interventricular artery and the circumflex artery. Again, these branch off the left coronary artery. Anterior interventricular artery and the circumflex artery. Now the anterior interventricular artery runs down the anterior interventricular sulcus. Now that's the groove on the surface of the heart between left and right ventricle. And it supplies the anterior walls of both ventricles. So the anterior ventricular artery is a major branch off the left coronary artery, runs down the anterior ventricular sulcus. That's that groove on the surface of the heart between the two ventricles. You've probably seen it on the models. And again, it supplies blood to the anterior wall of both ventricles. And also to the interventricular septum, the front part. The other major artery coming off the secondary, or excuse me, the left coronary artery is called the circumflex artery. The circumflex artery runs along the coronary retroventricular sulcus between the left atrium and left ventricle, and it supplies the wall of the left atrium and also the left ventricle, because it gives off branches that supply both. So it's coming off, again, the left coronary artery on the lateral side of the left ventricle. Again, these are the two major branches of the left coronary artery. And of course, they branch into smaller and smaller arteries, which you may concern yourself with. The right coronary artery runs along the coronary sulcus on the right side of the heart. Remember, that's the groove between the atrium and ventricles, sort of around the equator of the heart. And it splits into two major branches. The posterior interventricular artery, which runs along the posterior interventricular sulcus at the back side of the heart and supplies the posterior wall of both left and right ventricle. That's the posterior interventricular artery. So it supplies the posterior wall of both ventricles, left and right. And the other major branch off the right coronary artery, you can see, is the marginal artery. And that marginal artery supplies the lateral wall of the right ventricle. So these are the two major branches off of the left and right coronary artery, which I'd like you to know. Okay? And in lab, I expect you to pick out these vessels on the heart models, not on the sheath hearts, which are injected, on the heart models. They're readily visible. Returning blood then to the heart, or I should say from the heart wall, are what are called cardiac veins. So coronary arteries, cardiac veins. There are a number of these, but I'm only going to require you to know two. And these veins all drain into a major vein called the coronary sinus. That you've already seen, that runs along the atrioventricular sulcus, especially prominent at the back side of the heart, and runs into the right atrium. So it's draining blood from the heart itself. The two major cardiac veins are the anterior part of the heart, the great cardiac vein, which runs along that anterior ventricular sulcus, roughly paralleling the anterior ventricular artery. And again, it drains the anterior part of the heart. And the back of the heart, then, the middle cardiac vein, which runs along the posterior ventricular sulcus and roughly parallels the posterior ventricular artery, and it drains the posterior portion of the heart. So great cardiac vein, anterior, and middle cardiac vein, posterior. There are also other cardiac veins. You don't need to be concerned with those. Those are the two major ones I want you to see. And again, they're readily visible on the heart